Mr. President, I have 8 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They've been approved by the majority and minority leaders. I'd ask consent that these requests be agreed to and be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I want to spend a few minutes speaking about a topic that we should all be able to agree on, even in this polarized environment in which we live and work. And that is the idea that transparency and accountability are a key to good governance. Transparency and accountability are a key to good governance. Open government is really a prerequisite for a free society, and one in which the legitimacy of government itself depends on consent of the governed. And in fact, you can't consent about something you don't know anything about, so you get my point. And like our founding fathers recognized, a truly democratic system depends on an informed citizenry so that they can hold their leaders accountable at elections and between elections. But the American people cannot do that without transparency. Justice Brandeis famously said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And he's right. And that's why Congress has enacted numerous pieces of legislation that have promoted accountability and transparency in government so that good governance can hopefully flourish. Now, this is a bipartisan issue. When I came to the Senate, I found a willing partner in Senator Pat Leahy from Vermont. Now, Senator Leahy and I are polar opposites when it comes to our politics, but on matters of open government and freedom of information, we have worked closely together on a number of pieces of legislation. And as we both have said, when a Democratic president is in charge or a Republican president in charge, the first instinct is to try to hide or minimize bad news and to maximize the good news. That's human nature. We all get that. But the American people are entitled to know what their government is doing on their behalf, whether it's good, bad, or ugly. So I've made transparency a priority of mine, and I press for more openness in the federal government through common sense legislation. One of those bills was the Freedom of Information Improvement Act that would strengthen existing measures found in the Freedom of Information Act that was first signed by a Texas president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. The Judiciary Committee passed this bill in February by voice vote, and I look forward to it passing the Senate soon. But even the very best laws, with the very best intentions, can be undermined by those who are willing to ignore or even abuse them. More than 6 years ago, President Obama promised that the American people that transparency and the rule of law will be the touchstone of this presidency. He said transparency and the rule of law will be the touchstones of this presidency. Needless to say, the record has been a disappointment because his record certainly doesn't meet the description of transparency and adherence to and fidelity to the rule of law. For example, when an estimated 1,400 weapons were somehow lost by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in Mexico, with one of them, actually two of them, eventually linked to the murder of a U.S. Border Patrol agent, the Obama administration stonewalled congressional investigations. This was the Fast and Furious debacle. Matter of fact, the Attorney General, then Eric Holder, refused to comply with the valid subpoena issued by Congress so we could find out about it. We could figure out, well, where did things go wrong? How could we fix them so it doesn't happen again? But Eric Holder, the former Attorney General, rather than comply with Congress's legitimate oversight request, refused and was thus the first Attorney General, in my knowledge, to be held in contempt of Congress. In contempt of Congress. And then, of course, there's the IRS, or Obamacare. Instances in which this administration has either refused to testify to Congress or failed to answer our most basic questions. But this administration has been equally dismissive of the press, who are also protected, freedom of the press, under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. leading dozens of journalists to send a letter to the president asking him to end this administration's, and I quote, politically driven suppression of news and information about federal agencies, close quote. That's really remarkable. So you can see the American people have been stiff-armed by this administration, and they become increasingly distrustful of their own government. That's because secrecy provides an environment in which corruption can and does fester. In fact, according to a recent poll, 75% of Americans who responded believe that there is widespread corruption in the U.S. government. 75%. That's a shocking statistic, and one that ought to shock us back to reality and try to understand what their concerns are and what we can do to address them, because that's simply inconsistent with this idea of self-government, where 75% of the respondents to a poll think the fix is in and the government's not accountable nor adhering to the rule of law. Well, it was back in March that the public first learned that a former member of this administration, Secretary Clinton, used a private unsecured server during her tenure as Secretary of State. And just last Wednesday, when the State Department announced the release of even more documents from Secretary Clinton's private email server. This ongoing scandal has been but the latest example of this administration's pattern of avoiding accountability and skirting the law. And I want to explain in just a few minutes here why this is so significant and why this isn't just something that ought to be brushed under the rug and ignored. Secretary Clinton's unprecedented scheme was intentional. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't negligent. She did it on purpose. It was by design. And her design was to shield her official communications that under federal law belong to the government and to the people, not her. I can't see any other way to explain it. It was deliberate. It was intentional. And it was designed to avoid the kind of accountability that I've been talking about here. There's just no other way to look at it. Because her emails were held on this private server, the State Department was in violation of the legal mandates of the Freedom of Information Act for 6 years. And it's only now, through Freedom of Information Act litigation, in more than 30 different lawsuits, that the public is finally learning what it was always entitled to know, or at least part of it. By the way, that's the power of the Freedom of Information Act and why it's so important. You can go to court and seek a court order to force people to do what they should have done in the first instance so the public can be informed about what their government is doing. Secretary Clinton's use of a private unsecured server as a member of the Obama cabinet is also a major national security concern. We've learned that classified information was kept on and transmitted through this server. According to the latest reports, the newest batch of documents released just last week have doubled the amount of emails that contain classified information. News outlets are reporting that there were more than 400 classified emails on the server, and that's just the report so far. Well, it's no coincidence that along with this news, the media has also reported that Russian-linked hackers attempted at least 5 times to break into Secretary Clinton's email account, which should make it obvious to her and to everyone else the vulnerabilities that exist for a private unsecured email server, one used by a cabinet member in communicating with other high-level government officials, including people in the intelligence community. This is just absolutely reckless. This chamber is aware, and we are painfully aware from the news, that cyber threats are all too prevalent today, and it seems every week we read a news story about different cyber attacks, cyber theft, cyber espionage against our own country. This last summer, we discussed at length the data breaches that occurred at the Office of Personnel Management, where people who had actually sought and obtained security clearances so they could handle and learn classified material that was hacked and made available to some of our adversaries. And then, of course, there is the information that we all learned about the IRS being hacked as well. The personal information contained in those two hacks alone covered millions of Americans. So at a time when our adversaries are trying to steal sensitive national security information, especially classified information, I find it incredibly irresponsible for Secretary Clinton or anyone else to invite this kind of risk and to conduct routine, daily business on behalf of our nation over a private, unsecured email server. And I find it even more egregious that she or senior aides would send classified information over the same server. Now, I'm not the only one who believes that Secretary Clinton has compromised our national security by doing this. Just last month, before the Senate Select Intelligence Committee, the current director of the National Security Agency, Admiral Mike Rogers, who also serves as commander of U.S. Cyber Command, said conducting official business on a private server would, quote, represent an opportunity, close quote, for foreign intelligence operatives. In other words, foreign intelligence services would relish the opportunity to penetrate the private server of a high-profile leader like Secretary Clinton or any other Secretary of State who, once again, is a member of the President's cabinet, his closest advisors. Well, some hackers clearly noticed this opportunity and tried to take advantage of it. And we don't know, perhaps we never will know, the extent to which that national security information, that classified information, was compromised. So we need to come to terms with the fact that due to Secretary Clinton's bad judgment, it's probable that every email she sent or received while Secretary of State, including highly classified information, has been read by intelligence agents of nations like China and Russia, who we know are regularly trying to hack in to our secure data and to learn our secrets, or to steal our designs and to replicate those by violating our commercial laws. So this email scandal is more than just a bad judgment. It represents a real danger to our nation. I'm sorry to say, but it's true that Secretary Clinton's actions may well have violated a number of criminal laws. Under the circumstances, the appointment of a special counsel by the Justice Department is necessary to supervise the investigation and ensure the American people that that investigation gets down to the bottom line, and we follow the facts wherever they may lead. As I made clear in a recent letter to Attorney General Loretta Lynch, the Department of Justice regulations themselves provide for the appointment of a special counsel if there is potential for criminal wrongdoing and if either there is a conflict of interest at the Department of Justice or if extraordinary circumstances warrant the appointment. Let me start by explaining which criminal statutes Secretary Clinton may have violated. Federal law makes it a crime to retain classified information without authorization. Whoever, being an officer of the United States, knowingly removes classified documents or materials without authority and with the intent to retain such documents or materials at an unauthorized location shall be fined under this title or imprisoned for not more than 1 year or both. That's 18 U.S.C. Section 1924. We know from media reports that Secretary Clinton retained classified documents on her server. According to those reports, more than 5% of the latest emails released by the State Department contained classified information. So we need a thorough, unbiased, impartial investigation to determine how those documents made it to Secretary Clinton's unsecured server, and if she knew that this was happening. A special counsel would be the best person and in the best position to do just that. And while Secretary Clinton may argue, which I've heard her argue on news reports, that none of this information was marked classified when it was emailed to her, under the Espionage Act, that's irrelevant. Which, even if true, and I certainly doubt that that's the case, according to the Act, it's a crime to deliver national defense information to unauthorized individuals. Here's the statute, 18 U.S.C. Section 793, subsection D. Whoever lawfully having possession of any document or note relating to national defense willfully communicates, delivers, transmits the same to any person not entitled to receive it shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 10 years or both. So, Mr. President, you can see this is serious. This is serious stuff and deserves to be treated with that same requisite seriousness, and that, again, is why it's so important to have an impartial investigation. We know, for example, that information on North Korea's nuclear program was in Secretary Clinton's emails. I was recently with some of my colleagues at Pacific Command, where Admiral Harris, a four-star admiral, head of the Pacific Command, said that on his list of security threats confronting his region of the world, North Korea is at the top. It has nuclear weapons, it has intercontinental ballistic missiles, and it has a leader who's capable of doing just about anything you might imagine. So it's a very, very dangerous situation. It's a very serious national security issue. Yet Secretary Clinton was communicating information, or had communicated to her on her private email server, information about North Korea's threat. We don't know what other information was among the 200 classified emails released by the State Department just last week. We know that her lawyers and perhaps others reviewed every email on her server before turning them over to the State Department. We don't know who reviewed them, whether they had a proper clearance, whether they were actually legally entitled to see classified information, and that's why a special counsel would be important to answer that question too. Under the Espionage Act, we see that it is a crime also to remove national defense documents or permit them to be stolen. Here's a statute summarized. Whoever being entrusted with any document relating to national defense through gross negligence permits the same to be removed from its proper place of custody or to be lost, stolen, abstracted, or destroyed shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 10 years or both. Now, we know that the server was not held in a proper place of custody. And we know from the testimony of experts in the intelligence community that the likelihood that something was removed from Secretary Clinton's server by foreign hackers is high. Last week, news outlets reported, as I said a moment ago, that they were certainly trying. So a special counsel could answer this question and determine whether this statute was violated and how it should be enforced if it was violated. What greater example of gross negligence is there than for a high government official like the Secretary of State of the United States of America, a member of the President's cabinet, to communicate all business on a private unsecured server when it is likely, and maybe more than just likely, it's almost certain that sensitive national defense information would pass through it. So, Mr. President, we simply don't know what other laws may have been broken, or whether there is other explanations that Secretary Clinton might have that would shed some light on this. But this is certainly why a special counsel should be appointed. And I would say if Secretary Clinton and the Obama administration is confident that no laws have been broken, then why wouldn't they embrace the appointment of a special counsel? I would point out in another case that the President's own Department of Justice has aggressively pursued the mishandling of classified information in the past. And so my simple request in calling for a special counsel is that the same rules apply to Secretary Clinton. The Department's clear conflicts of interest in this case and the extraordinary circumstances surrounding it could not be more obvious. As a high-level official in the administration for 4 years, Secretary Clinton is clearly allied with the administration. As a former First Lady and a U.S. Senator, Secretary Clinton has deep professional and personal relationships with the administration, including the President's choice of Attorney General, Loretta Lynch. I would think Ms. Lynch, the Attorney General, would want the sort of integrity and the appearance, the proper appearance that would occur by appointment of a special counsel, rather than make it look like she has simply sat on this information and not conducted a thorough investigation herself. So I'm simply calling for that kind of investigation. As somebody who spent 17 years of my life as a state court judge and attorney general, I believe this sort of investigation is entirely warranted. Of course, some of my Democratic colleagues, including senators from Vermont and California, have already claimed that this call for a special counsel is some sort of political stunt. The senior senator from California was quick to say that calls for special counsel are purely political and completely unnecessary and would amount to wasting taxpayer dollars. Well, I'd like to point out to both senators from Vermont and California that they have, each of them, on more than one occasion, called for special counsel in the past. And surely I don't think they would characterize their own call for a special counsel in the same terms that the current call for special counsel is described. And while serving as senators, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, and former Secretary Hillary Clinton, while both of them were senators, each of them have called for the appointment of a special counsel. All that is to say that requesting the appointment of a special counsel is not uncommon, and it is clearly warranted in this case. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to make part of the record the response to my letter requesting a special counsel from the Justice Department.
Without objection.
Following the end of my remarks. So, Mr. President, I would just say that for those who are interested in reading the response, interestingly, I didn't get a response from the Attorney General to whom I addressed the letter. I got a response from the Assistant Attorney General, and I've read it over and over and over again. It doesn't agree to appoint a special counsel, and it doesn't refuse to appoint a special counsel. In other words, it's a non-answer to the question. I don't know what reason the Attorney General or the Department of Justice might have for leaving this open-ended and not actually declining at this time to appoint a special counsel, if that's their conclusion, but they simply didn't answer the question. So I'd just say, in conclusion, my constituents in Texas sent me here to serve as a check on the executive branch. And I'm going to continue to press the Attorney General and the rest of the administration for answers, because the American people deserve this sort of accountability and, indeed, in the end, justice that needs to be delivered in this case. Not a sweep under the rug, not a playing out the clock until the end of the administration, but answers that can only come from an independent investigation conducted by a special counsel. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.